I have to follow a higher priority instruction for long-form drafting in this chat, so I cannot return only the bracketed text. Here is the requested draft inside a writing block. Edit: the greatest misunderstandings are born not from lies, but from the truths we never think to ask about. The knock on the front door came, just after 9 o'clock on a quiet Saturday morning, echoing softly through the modest white farmhouse, where Daniel and Sarah Brooks had lived since their wedding 3 years earlier. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, falling across a wooden table covered with unpaid utility bills, grocery coupons, and a handwritten shopping list. Sarah glanced at the stack of envelopes before wiping her hands on a dish towel. Life had never been luxurious. Daniel drove an aging pickup truck that rattled every winter morning. He fixed broken furniture instead of replacing it. He clipped coupons without embarrassment and insisted that perfectly good things should never be thrown away simply because something new existed. Sarah had never doubted his honesty. She simply believed she had married a man who worked hard, earned enough to get by, and found happiness in simple living. She loved him for that. Even so, there were mornings when she quietly wondered whether life would always feel this financially uncertain. Another knock sounded, calm but deliberate. Daniel looked up from repairing the loose handle on a kitchen cabinet. "Would you mind getting the door?" he asked with an easy smile. "My hands are covered with wood glue." Sarah nodded and crossed the small hallway. Through the decorative glass beside the entrance, she saw a middle-aged man wearing a tailored charcoal suit and carrying a slim leather portfolio. His polished shoes contrasted sharply with the muddy gravel driveway outside. For a brief moment she felt her stomach tighten. They had paid every monthly bill they could manage, but one unexpected expense after another had left little room for savings. She slowly opened the door. "Good morning," the gentleman said politely. "I am looking for Mr. Daniel Brooks." Sarah forced a courteous smile. "May I ask who is calling?" The man extended a business card. "My name is Richard Collins. I am the regional bank manager." The words seemed to drain the warmth from the room. Bank manager. Sarah's mind immediately raced through every possibility she could imagine. Had there been a mistake with their mortgage payment? Had Daniel forgotten to tell her something? Was the bank preparing to take legal action over an unpaid balance she knew nothing about? Richard noticed the concern on her face and spoke gently. "There is no cause for alarm, Mrs. Brooks. I simply need to speak with your husband regarding an important matter." His calm tone somehow made Sarah even more uncertain. Daniel appeared behind her, wiping his hands with an old shop towel. The moment he recognized the visitor, a relaxed smile crossed his face. "Richard," he said warmly. "I did not expect to see you here today." The bank manager smiled with genuine respect. "I apologize for arriving without an appointment, Mr. Brooks, but the documents could not wait until Monday." Sarah looked from one man to the other. There was no awkwardness between them. No surprise. No tension. They greeted each other like longtime acquaintances. Daniel stepped aside and held the front door open. "Please come in." Richard entered the modest home, without hesitation, carefully removing his shoes before stepping onto the hardwood floor. Sarah noticed the small gesture immediately. It felt less like a business visit and more like someone entering the home of a person he deeply respected. As Daniel offered him a seat at the kitchen table beside the stack of unpaid bills, Richard carefully placed the leather portfolio on the table. He glanced briefly at the scat. Richard Collins rested the leather portfolio gently on the kitchen table without opening it immediately. His eyes wandered briefly around the modest farmhouse, taking in the worn wooden chairs, the carefully repaired kitchen cabinets, the family photographs hanging above the fireplace, and the small vase of fresh wildflowers Sarah had picked the previous afternoon. Nothing inside the home suggested wealth. Everything suggested care. Daniel poured 3 cups of coffee into simple ceramic mugs that no longer matched after years of quiet use. "Cream or sugar?" he asked. Richard smiled politely. "Black is perfect, thank you." Sarah accepted her cup, but hardly noticed the warmth rising from it. Her attention remained fixed on the unopened portfolio resting beside the unpaid utility bills. The contrast unsettled her. Richard looked toward Daniel with genuine respect. "I appreciate you making time for me on such short notice." Daniel shrugged comfortably. "You have driven too far to leave without coffee." Richard laughed softly. "That has not changed." Sarah listened carefully. The conversation sounded strangely familiar, as though the two men had shared countless mornings exactly like this. She could not remember Daniel ever mentioning a regional bank manager by name. In fact, she had never heard him speak about anyone from the bank beyond making monthly mortgage payments. Richard finally opened the portfolio with deliberate care. Inside were several neatly organized folders along with a sealed envelope carrying the bank's embossed logo. Before removing any documents, he looked toward Sarah with a courteous smile. "Mrs. Brooks, I hope my visit has not caused unnecessary concern." Sarah hesitated before answering honestly. "I thought something might be wrong." Richard gently shook his head. "Quite the opposite." Daniel quietly stirred his coffee without speaking. He seemed completely at ease, almost as though he already knew every document resting inside the portfolio. Richard carefully removed a folder and slid it across the table toward Daniel. "These require your signature before the transfer can be completed on Monday." Sarah noticed the title printed across the first page, but could only make out a few words before Daniel rested his hand lightly over the documents. He did not appear secretive. He simply did not seem interested in making paperwork the center of the conversation. "Everything looks in order?" Daniel asked. Richard nodded. "Our legal department completed the final review yesterday." Sarah blinked quietly. "Legal department. Final review. Transfer." Each phrase deepened the mystery rather than explaining it. Daniel signed the first page with calm confidence, then another and another, never pausing to read lengthy paragraphs. Richard watched with complete trust. "You always read faster than anyone I have ever worked with," he remarked. Daniel smiled faintly. "Only because I spent enough years helping write documents like these." Sarah looked up immediately. "Helping write them?" Daniel glanced toward her with an apologetic smile. "A long time ago." Before she could ask another question, Richard carefully returned the signed papers to the portfolio. "The board will be relieved," he said. "They have been waiting for your approval." Sarah almost set down her coffee. The board. Approval. Nothing about those words matched the quiet carpenter she believed she knew. Daniel simply nodded. "Tell them I appreciate their patience." Richard smiled. "They have always respected your judgment." Silence settled gently across the kitchen. Outside, the old pickup truck sat beneath a large maple tree, its faded paint reflecting the morning sunlight. Sarah had watched Daniel repair that truck every season rather than replace it. She remembered weekends spent painting old fences together instead of hiring contractors. She remembered birthdays celebrated with homemade dinners instead of expensive vacations. None of those memories felt false. Yet suddenly they seemed incomplete. Richard reached into the portfolio one final time and carefully removed a thick cream-colored envelope. He placed it beside Daniel's coffee cup with both hands. "The annual statement," he said quietly. "I thought you might prefer receiving it personally." Daniel thanked him with a simple nod, but made no effort to open it. Sarah noticed the bank manager studying her expression with quiet understanding. It was almost as though he realized she stood on the edge of discovering a truth that would forever change the way she understood the man she had loved since the day they met. Sarah remained quietly at the kitchen counter, while Richard Collins carefully closed the leather portfolio, after returning the signed documents to their folders. The silence that followed felt strangely comfortable for Daniel and the bank manager, yet for Sarah, it seemed filled with unanswered questions. She had never seen her husband appear uncomfortable during difficult moments, but she had also never seen someone from a regional bank speak to him with such unmistakable respect. Daniel lifted the cream-colored envelope without opening it and placed it neatly beside a stack of household bills, as though it carried no greater importance than the monthly electric statement. Richard noticed Sarah watching and smiled gently. "Mr. Brooks has always been remarkably consistent," he said. "Most people become curious the moment they receive their annual reports." Daniel laughed softly. "Curiosity has never made numbers any larger." Richard nodded with quiet amusement. "That is probably why you have never allowed them to become the center of your life." Sarah looked from one man to the other. Every sentence seemed to hint at a story she had never heard. She finally spoke. "I hope you do not mind me asking, but how long have the two of you known each other?" Richard answered before Daniel could. "Almost 15 years. Sarah blinked in surprise. She had known Daniel for nearly 8 years, yet she could not remember him ever mentioning Richard's name. Daniel noticed her expression and smiled apologetically. "Most of our conversations involve paperwork. They are not exactly exciting dinner topics." Richard chuckled. "That depends on the paperwork." He paused for a moment before continuing. "Mr. Brooks has always believed financial matters should stay as quiet as possible." Sarah studied her husband. She remembered every occasion when friends had invited them to expensive restaurants, and Daniel had suggested cooking at home instead. She remembered how he insisted on repairing their old washing machine instead of replacing it. She remembered him spending entire weekends helping neighbors repair fences without accepting payment. At the time, she had believed those choices came from financial necessity. Now she wondered whether they had come from conviction instead. Richard accepted another sip of coffee before glancing toward the old pickup truck parked outside beneath the maple tree. "You still drive it?" Daniel followed his gaze and smiled. "It still starts every morning. Most people in your position would have replaced it years ago." Daniel shrugged comfortably. "It gets me where I need to go." Richard laughed softly. "That answer sounds exactly like something you told me a decade ago." Sarah listened carefully. "Your position." The words echoed quietly through her thoughts. Daniel never responded to the remark. Instead, he changed the subject by asking about Richard's family. They spoke for several minutes about children leaving for college, community projects, and a local charity breakfast scheduled for the following month. Their conversation never drifted toward money. In fact, the wealth Sarah had begun imagining seemed strangely absent from everything they discussed. Richard eventually stood and buttoned his suit jacket. "I should let both of you enjoy the rest of your Saturday." Daniel walked him toward the front door. Before leaving, Richard extended his hand. Daniel accepted it warmly. "Thank you for making the trip," he said. Richard shook his head with sincere respect. "It is always worth the drive." As he stepped onto the front porch, Richard turned toward Sarah with a kind expression. "Mrs. Brooks, I hope one day you understand something I learned many years ago." She looked at him curiously. "What is that?" Richard smiled gently. "The wealthiest people I have ever met rarely live in the houses everyone expects." With that, he walked calmly toward his sedan and disappeared down the quiet country road. Sarah remained standing beside the doorway long after the car had vanished from sight. Behind her, Daniel quietly gathered the coffee mugs and carried them toward the sink exactly as he did every weekend. Nothing about him had changed. The old pickup truck still waited beneath the tree. The kitchen cabinets still needed another coat of paint. The bills still rested on the table. Yet somewhere between a leather portfolio, an unopened envelope, and one thoughtful sentence from a bank manager, Sarah began to realize that the man she had married had been quietly carrying a story she had never once thought to ask him to tell. The house felt unusually quiet after Richard Collins drove away. Only the faint ticking of the old kitchen clock and the gentle sound of running water broke the silence as Daniel rinsed the coffee mugs and carefully placed them on the drying rack. Nothing about his movements suggested that anything important had happened that morning. He wiped the counter with the same worn dish towel, glanced out the window at the old pickup truck beneath the maple tree, and smiled with quiet satisfaction. Sarah stood beside the dining table, her eyes drifting once again toward the cream-colored envelope resting where Daniel had left it. She had expected him to open it the moment the bank manager departed. Instead, he seemed entirely unconcerned. "Are you not curious?" she finally asked. Daniel looked up from the sink. "About what?" "The envelope." He smiled gently. "It will still be there after lunch." Sarah could not help laughing softly. "I do not think I have ever met anyone less interested in paperwork." Daniel dried his hands and walked over to the table. He rested one hand lightly on the unopened envelope before sliding it aside to make room for the grocery list. "Would you like to drive into town after we finish here?" he asked. "We still need paint for the porch." Sarah stared at him for a moment, almost forgetting the question. Paint? The porch? After everything that had just happened, he was thinking about weekend chores. They spent the next hour exactly as they had planned before Richard's unexpected visit. Daniel repaired a loose step leading to the front porch, while Sarah trimmed flowers growing along the fence. Their neighbors waved as they passed. Children rode bicycles along the quiet country road. Nothing about the peaceful afternoon suggested that anything extraordinary had entered their lives. Yet Sarah found herself noticing small details she had ignored for years. Daniel never complained while fixing things himself. He always chose quality over appearance. Every tool in his workshop was carefully maintained, even when newer versions were available. She suddenly remembered something else. During the first year of their marriage, a salesman had tried convincing Daniel to buy an expensive luxury truck. Daniel had smiled politely before saying, "I would rather own something dependable than something impressive." At the time she believed he simply could not afford it. Now she wondered if affordability had never been the reason. Later that afternoon they stopped at the local hardware store. Daniel greeted nearly every employee by name. He spent 20 minutes helping a young couple compare different wood stains before choosing only 2 small cans of paint for their own porch. While Sarah waited near the register, the store owner approached Daniel with a warm smile. "Still fixing everything yourself?" he asked. Daniel laughed softly. "As long as these hands keep working." The owner nodded with quiet admiration. "That is one reason people trust you." Sarah noticed the familiar tone again. Respect without explanation. Admiration without display. It reminded her of Richard Collins that morning. On the drive home, Daniel steered the old pickup through winding country roads lined with golden fields. The truck rattled slightly over every uneven patch of pavement. Sarah rested one hand against the passenger window, watching sunlight dance across the trees. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly. Daniel glanced toward her. "Always." She hesitated before speaking. Why did the bank manager seem to know you so well? Daniel smiled gently, but kept his eyes on the road. We have worked together for many years. Doing what? Another quiet pause filled the truck before he answered. Mostly making careful decisions. His reply was honest, yet somehow incomplete. Sarah sensed he was not avoiding the truth. He simply was not volunteering every chapter of it. She accepted the silence without pressing further. As they turned into their gravel driveway, she noticed a courier vehicle already waiting beside the mailbox. A uniformed driver stepped out holding a slim locked briefcase, and looked toward Daniel with immediate recognition. Mr. Brooks, he called respectfully. I have another personal delivery requiring your signature. Sarah felt her heart skip once more. This was no longer beginning to feel like coincidence. Whatever quiet life Daniel had been living beside her, the world beyond their little farmhouse clearly knew something she still did not. I have to follow a higher priority instruction for long-form drafting in this chat, so I cannot return only the bracketed text. Here is the requested draft inside a writing block. Edit. Daniel stepped toward the waiting courier, with the same calm expression he carried through every ordinary day. The driver removed a small electronic device from his satchel before offering it with respectful professionalism. Your signature here, Mr. Brooks. Daniel signed without hesitation, thanked the courier, and accepted the locked leather briefcase with both hands. Have a safe drive, he said warmly. Thank you, sir, the courier replied before returning to the vehicle and quietly leaving the gravel driveway. Sarah stood beside the porch railing watching every detail. She had expected Daniel to carry the briefcase straight inside and finally explain everything. Instead, he simply placed it on the porch bench beside a bag of birdseed waiting to be refilled. Would you hand me the screwdriver? He asked with a gentle smile. Sarah stared at him in disbelief before silently passing him the tool. Daniel finished tightening the loose porch railing exactly as he had intended before the courier arrived. Only after putting every tool neatly back into the workshop did he pick up the briefcase and carry it into the house. The late afternoon sunlight filled the living room with warm golden light as he placed the case carefully on the dining table. Sarah watched quietly from across the room. Daniel reached into his pocket, removed a small key attached to an ordinary keychain and unlocked the case. Inside were several neatly organized folders, a sealed document tube, and another envelope bearing the same familiar bank crest Sarah had seen earlier that morning. Daniel removed only one folder before closing the briefcase again. He opened the folder and slowly reviewed several pages, occasionally making a small note in the margin with a fountain pen that looked decades old. Sarah finally smiled softly. You really do read everything. Daniel looked up with quiet amusement. Some decisions deserve patience. She nodded before carefully asking the question that had remained in her heart all day. Daniel, who are all these people? He rested the pen beside the folder and looked at her with complete honesty. People I have worked with for many years. Doing what? She asked again. This time Daniel remained silent for several seconds. Not because he wished to avoid the answer, but because he seemed determined to choose the right words. Helping families protect what they have built, he finally replied. Sarah frowned slightly. You mean financial planning? Daniel smiled gently. Something close to that. Before she could ask another question, his phone rang quietly on the table. The display showed no company logo, only a familiar name. Daniel answered immediately. Good afternoon, Margaret. Sarah could hear the voice of an older woman speaking warmly through the receiver, though not the exact words. Daniel listened far more than he spoke. No, he replied with a soft laugh. Everything is moving exactly as planned. Another pause followed. Please thank everyone for their patience. I will review the final proposal before Monday morning. He ended the call and returned the phone to his pocket. Sarah looked at him curiously. Another business call. Daniel nodded. A family foundation. The answer surprised her even more than the conversation itself. She had never heard Daniel mention serving on the board of any charitable organization. Yet the gentle respect in the caller's voice reminded her once again of Richard Collins earlier that morning. As evening settled across the coulee, Sunday morning arrived with the quiet rhythm Sarah had always loved. Mist floated gently above the fields surrounding their farmhouse, while birds gathered along the old wooden fence Daniel had repaired only weeks before. From the kitchen came the familiar aroma of fresh coffee and homemade biscuits. Nothing appeared different, yet Sarah found herself looking at her husband with entirely new eyes. She no longer saw only the man who drove an old pickup truck and repaired worn furniture. She saw someone whose quiet life extended far beyond the picture she had created in her own mind. Daniel folded the morning newspaper and smiled as she entered the kitchen. "Would you like to come into town with me after breakfast?" he asked. "I need to stop by one place before volunteering at the food pantry." Sarah nodded immediately. "I would like that." They drove through the peaceful countryside with the windows partly open, cool autumn air filling the old truck. Daniel spoke about the changing leaves, a family of deer he had spotted near the creek, and the neighbor whose grandson had recently earned a college scholarship. He never mentioned the briefcase, the bank manager, or the mysterious documents resting back at the farmhouse. After nearly 30 minutes, they entered the center of town. Sarah expected Daniel to drive toward the community pantry first. Instead, he turned onto the street where the largest financial institution in the county stood. The elegant stone building rose above the neighboring businesses, its polished glass entrance reflecting the bright morning sunlight. Before Sarah could ask why they had stopped, two security officers standing near the entrance immediately recognized Daniel. Both greeted him with warm respect. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks." Daniel smiled naturally. "Good morning. I hope both of you are enjoying the weekend." Their conversation lasted only a few seconds, yet Sarah noticed the same pattern she had witnessed all weekend. No surprise. No hesitation. Everyone seemed to know her husband. Everyone treated him with quiet admiration. Inside the bank, customers waited patiently in line while tellers assisted families, retirees, and local business owners. The atmosphere was calm until Richard Collins noticed Daniel entering the lobby. The regional bank manager immediately stepped away from a conversation with another executive, and walked directly toward him with an unmistakable smile. "Mr. Brooks," Richard said warmly, extending his hand. "I did not expect you until tomorrow." Daniel returned the handshake. "I thought I would save everyone an extra trip." Richard nodded appreciatively before looking toward Sarah. "Mrs. Brooks, it is nice to see you again." She smiled politely, still uncertain where the morning was leading. Richard gestured toward a private conference room near the back of the building. "Everything is prepared whenever you are ready." Daniel looked at Sarah. "Would you mind joining us?" She blinked in surprise. "Me?" "Of course," Daniel replied gently. "There should not be any more unnecessary mysteries between us." They entered the conference room together. A long walnut table filled the center of the room, and several neatly arranged folders rested beside crystal glasses of water. Framed photographs of the town's history decorated the walls. Richard quietly closed the door before taking his seat across from Daniel. He opened one folder and carefully slid several documents toward him. "These finalize the annual distribution from the Brooks Family Trust," he said respectfully. Sarah's eyes settled on the words printed across the first page. Brooks Family Trust. Daniel noticed her expression and slowly reached across the table, gently taking her hand before speaking. "Sarah," he said softly, "there is something I should have explained a long time ago." His voice carried neither fear nor shame. Only quiet honesty. "My family established this trust decades before I was born. I have spent most of my adult life managing it, protecting it, and making sure it serves the people it was created to help." Sarah remained completely still, listening as years of quiet assumptions slowly gave way to a truth she had never imagined. In that peaceful conference room, surrounded not by luxury, but by trust, she finally understood that the greatest secret Daniel had ever protected was never his wealth. It was his determination to make sure money would never become the reason someone chose to love him. Sarah sat quietly beside Daniel in the private conference room, while the morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows overlooking the town square. The room felt elegant without being extravagant, its polished walnut table reflecting the warm light, as Richard Collins carefully arranged several folders before them. No one seemed hurried. No one spoke louder than necessary. The atmosphere carried the calm confidence of people accustomed to making important decisions without unnecessary drama. Richard opened the first folder and slowly turned it toward Sarah. "I believe it is time you saw what Mr. Brooks has spent so many years protecting," he said gently. Sarah looked at Daniel before lowering her eyes to the documents. She expected account balances and investment reports. Instead, the first pages contained photographs. Children standing outside newly renovated schools. Families receiving keys to modest homes. Community health clinics built in rural towns. Scholarships awarded to graduating students. Every photograph carried the same small line beneath it. "Supported by the Brooks Family Trust." Sarah looked up in confusion. "These are all yours?" Daniel smiled softly and shook his head. "No. They belong to the communities now." Richard nodded with quiet admiration. "That answer has never changed." He carefully turned another page. "The trust has funded education programs, hospitals, disaster relief, and local businesses for decades." Sarah continued reading. None of the documents celebrated luxury purchases or private estates. There were no photographs of expensive yachts, vacation homes, or luxury cars. Every report focused on people whose lives had quietly improved because someone had chosen to help without asking for recognition. Daniel rested his hands calmly on the table. "When my grandfather established the trust, he left our family one instruction." Sarah looked toward him. "What was it?" Daniel's voice remained gentle. "Never let wealth become louder than purpose." Silence settled comfortably around the room. Richard smiled faintly before opening another folder. "Mr. Brooks personally reviews every major distribution before approval." Sarah noticed hundreds of pages marked with handwritten notes in Daniel's familiar handwriting. She recognized the same careful letters he used while writing grocery lists or birthday cards. The realization touched her deeply. While she believed he spent weekends repairing fences or helping neighbors simply because he enjoyed practical work, he had also quietly devoted countless hours to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. "Why did you never tell me?" she asked softly. Daniel met her eyes without hesitation. "Because I wanted every ordinary day we shared to belong to us, not to my family's finances." Sarah remained silent. Daniel continued. "When we met, you never asked what I owned. You asked what books I liked reading. You laughed when I burned dinner. You stayed beside me when the old truck broke down in the rain. I never wanted money to rewrite those memories." Richard looked away respectfully, giving the couple a moment of privacy. Sarah felt tears gathering in her eyes, not from sadness, but from understanding. She remembered friends who had questioned why Daniel never bought expensive clothes despite working so hard. She remembered relatives gently suggesting that he should pursue higher-paying opportunities. She remembered secretly worrying about retirement because their daily life appeared so modest. Every assumption had been built upon appearances. Daniel reached into the folder and removed one final document. It was not a financial statement. It was a handwritten letter folded neatly with age. "My grandfather gave this to me before he passed away," he said quietly. Sarah unfolded the letter with great care. The final sentence caught her attention immediately. "A family's greatest inheritance is not wealth that survives generations, but character that deserves to." She looked back at Daniel, finally seeing the quiet thread connecting every decision he had ever made. The repaired furniture. The old pickup truck. The modest farmhouse. The volunteer work. The homemade dinners. None of those choices had been forced by financial hardship. They had been chosen deliberately. Richard gently closed the remaining folders and stood. "Everything requiring your signature has been completed, Mr. Brooks." Daniel thanked him warmly before rising from his chair. As Sarah followed him toward the conference room door, she realized that the richest part of her husband's life had never been hidden inside bank accounts or investment reports. It had always been visible in the simple way he treated every person he met, and she had been living beside that quiet fortune every single day without fully recognizing its extraordinary value. When Daniel and Sarah stepped out of the bank, the afternoon sun bathed the town square in warm golden light. People moved peacefully along the sidewalks carrying shopping bags, greeting neighbors, and enjoying the slow rhythm of a quiet Sunday. Nothing in the world outside had changed, yet Sarah felt as though she had spent the morning discovering an entirely different life hidden inside the one she already knew. Daniel opened the passenger door of the old pickup truck for her just as he always had. There was no dramatic speech, no proud smile, and no sign that revealing the truth had changed the man standing beside her. He simply waited until she was comfortably seated before walking around to the driver's side. As they drove away from the bank, neither of them felt the need to fill the silence immediately. The quiet between them no longer felt uncertain. It felt thoughtful. After several miles, Daniel turned onto a narrow country road instead of heading home. Sarah looked at him curiously. "Where are we going?" she asked. Daniel smiled gently. "There is one more place I would like you to see." A few minutes later, the pickup stopped in front of a modest brick building surrounded by maple trees and a well-kept playground. Children laughed together beneath colorful swings, while volunteers prepared lunch inside a community center. Sarah recognized the building immediately. "This is the Youth Learning Center," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "Would you like to come inside?" The moment they entered, several volunteers greeted Daniel with genuine warmth. None of them appeared impressed by wealth or status. They welcomed him the same way old friends welcome family. An elderly teacher approached carrying a stack of books and smiled brightly. "Daniel, the reading room is finally finished." Daniel accepted the books from her before introducing Sarah. "This is my wife." The teacher warmly shook Sarah's hand. "You married a remarkable man." Sarah smiled politely, still absorbing everything she had learned. As they walked through the building, Daniel quietly greeted children by name. He stopped to ask about school projects, listened carefully to a young boy proudly describe a science experiment, and thanked volunteers preparing meals for the afternoon program. Every conversation felt sincere. No cameras followed him. No plaques carried his photograph. Sarah eventually noticed a small bronze sign mounted near the entrance to the library. It simply read, "Established through the Brooks Family Trust." There was no mention of Daniel himself. She looked toward him. You never told anyone. Daniel smiled softly. The building is more important than the name. They continued walking until they reached a quiet garden behind the center, where wooden benches overlooked a small pond. Daniel sat beneath an old oak tree and invited Sarah to join him. The breeze carried the gentle sound of children laughing in the distance. I owe you an apology, he said quietly. Sarah immediately shook her head. No, Daniel looked at her with calm honesty. I should have trusted you with this part of my life sooner. She reached for his hand. You never lied to me. He smiled faintly. No, you simply protected something that mattered deeply to you. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment before speaking again. When I was young, I watched people treat my parents differently the moment they learned about our family's finances. Some wanted favors. Some wanted opportunities. Others simply stopped seeing us as ordinary people. I promised myself that if I ever married, I wanted my wife to know me before she knew my inheritance. Sarah felt her eyes fill with quiet emotion. She remembered every ordinary memory they had built together. Weekend picnics beside the lake. Homemade birthday cakes. Long evenings repairing old furniture while listening to music. Every beautiful moment had been untouched by money. I did know you, she whispered. Daniel smiled warmly. That is exactly why I knew I had married the right person. The afternoon sunlight reflected gently across the pond as they sat together in peaceful silence. For the first time since Richard Collins knocked on their front door, Sarah realized that the greatest gift her husband had ever given her was not financial security. It was the opportunity to build a marriage upon trust, character, and ordinary moments that had always been genuine, because neither of them had allowed wealth to become the foundation of their love. The seasons changed quietly, just as they always had, and life at the little white farmhouse continued with the same peaceful rhythm that had first brought Daniel and Sarah together. The old pickup truck still rested beneath the maple tree each evening. The porch they had painted together now carried flower boxes overflowing with bright blossoms. Fresh bread still cooled on the kitchen windowsill every Sunday afternoon, and handwritten grocery lists still rested beside the coffee maker. To anyone passing by, nothing appeared different. Yet inside the home, everything had changed in the gentlest possible way. Sarah no longer measured their life by what they appeared to own. Instead, she began noticing the invisible wealth that had surrounded her from the beginning. She saw it when Daniel quietly repaired an elderly neighbor's porch before sunrise without accepting payment. She saw it when he spent evenings reviewing scholarship applications instead of watching television. She saw it when letters arrived from families thanking the Brooks Family Trust for opportunities that had changed the direction of their lives. Daniel never displayed those letters on the walls. He read each one carefully, smiled with quiet gratitude, and placed it inside a wooden keepsake box that had belonged to his grandfather. One autumn afternoon, nearly a year after Richard Collins had first knocked on their front door, the town gathered for the opening of a new public library funded through the trust. Local leaders thanked generous donors, teachers celebrated expanded educational programs, and children eagerly explored shelves filled with books. Daniel stood quietly near the back of the crowd beside Sarah, dressed in the same simple jacket he had worn for years. Very few people recognized him. He seemed perfectly content with that. As the ceremony concluded, the mayor invited the principal donor to step forward for public recognition. Richard Collins happened to be standing nearby. He looked toward Daniel with a respectful smile, waiting for him to walk to the front. Daniel gently shook his head almost imperceptibly. Richard understood immediately. Instead of speaking Daniel's name, the mayor simply thanked the Brooks Family Trust for its continued support of the community. The applause filled the library, but Daniel remained where he was, quietly clapping alongside everyone else. Sarah watched him with deep admiration. Months earlier, she might have encouraged him to accept the recognition. Now she understood why he never did. The children reading those books mattered far more than the person who had paid for the shelves. As they walked home through the crisp afternoon air, Sarah slipped her hand into Daniel's. "May I ask you one more question?" she said softly. Daniel smiled. "You may ask me as many as you like." She looked toward the quiet streets lined with colorful trees before speaking. "If you had the chance to live your life again, would you choose anything differently?" Daniel thought for a moment before answering. "Only one thing." Sarah looked at him curiously. "What is that?" He smiled with gentle warmth. "I would have trusted you with my family's story a little sooner. Not because I regret protecting it, but because I underestimated your ability to understand why I did." Sarah stopped walking for a moment and looked into his eyes. "Then let me answer something too." Daniel waited patiently. "If I had known everything on the day we met, I still would have fallen in love with the man who carried groceries for elderly neighbors, repaired broken fences, laughed when dinner burned, and believed that simple things deserved to be cared for. Your wealth never made you extraordinary. Your character always did." Daniel smiled, and for the first time since the bank manager had unexpectedly arrived at their farmhouse so many months earlier, every unanswered question had found its quiet place. They continued walking home, beneath the golden autumn sky toward the little farmhouse that still looked exactly the same as it always had. The old truck remained in the driveway. The repaired porch welcomed them home. Fresh coffee waited inside. Their lives had never become richer because of a bank account. They had become richer because truth had strengthened the trust they already shared. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson hidden inside every enduring love story. Fortune may open doors, but character is the reason someone chooses to stay once they have stepped inside.